Chapter 1. The Boy Genius, Early Life and Childhood of Ted Kaczynski. Theodore John Kaczynski was born on May 22, 1942 in Chicago, Illinois, to Theodore R. Kaczynski, a working-class sausage factory worker, and his wife Wanda Dombeck, a homemaker. The Kaczynskis were of Polish descent and practiced a modest lifestyle. Though not wealthy, they were a close-knit, intellectual and supportive family that deeply valued education and critical thinking. From the beginning, young Ted showed signs of profound intelligence that set him apart from other children. A troubled but gifted child, Ted was a quiet and introverted child, often showing signs of social withdrawal. At just 9 months old, he suffered a severe allergic reaction to a medication that led to a prolonged hospital stay, during which his parents were not permitted to visit him regularly. According to later psychological speculation, this early trauma may have deeply affected his developing sense of attachment and social trust. His mother, Wanda, noted that after returning home, Ted seemed emotionally distant. He no longer smiled or showed affection easily. This behavior would continue well into his adult life. Despite his emotional distance, Ted demonstrated remarkable cognitive abilities. He was reading at a very early age, and teachers soon noticed that he was performing far beyond grade level in most subjects. By middle school, he was already classified as academically gifted. His natural inclination toward math and logic became evident, and he often spent hours on advanced problems far beyond what was expected for his age. Isolation and acceleration. At Evergreen Park Community High School, Ted skipped 6th grade, accelerating him ahead of his peers by at least a year. While this may have supported his academic growth, socially it had the opposite effect. He was smaller, younger, and more sensitive than his classmates, often becoming the target of teasing and bullying. Instead of forging close friendships, Ted withdrew further, immersing himself in mathematics and solitary pursuits. He excelled at everything from algebra to chemistry, German, and biology, but rarely engaged in social clubs or sports. A recurring theme in his young life was isolation. He lived largely inside his mind, and those who knew him described him as intelligent, odd, and emotionally distant. Early glimpses of discontent. As a teenager, Ted began to show a deepening skepticism toward authority and institutional power. He was repelled by the conformity and suburban complacency he saw around him. Though he wasn't overtly political at the time, he would often express a disdain for modern society and the expectations placed upon young people to conform and succeed in traditional ways. Even then, it was clear that Ted's thoughts did not align with the world around him. These sentiments would later evolve into the foundation of his anti-technological philosophy. But for now, they lingered in the background, an undercurrent of dissatisfaction brewing in the mind of a lonely prodigy. Harvard at 16. In 1958, at just 16 years old, Ted Kaczynski earned a scholarship to Harvard University, one of the most prestigious institutions in the world. On paper, it was the ultimate accomplishment for a young genius, but in reality, it marked the beginning of his descent into deeper isolation and alienation. At Harvard, he was physically and emotionally unprepared for the maturity and lifestyle of the student body. He lived in a small dormitory unit specifically designed for younger students and was often surrounded by roommates who were 2 to 4 years older than him. Though he maintained excellent grades and became deeply involved in mathematics, his social life was almost non-existent. He was deeply introverted and even by Harvard standards, a place full of eccentric minds, he stood out as unusually withdrawn. The Murray experiment. Perhaps the most disturbing and formative experience of Ted's college years came from his participation in a controversial psychological study conducted by Dr. Henry A. Murray, a former OSS operative and respected psychology professor. The study aimed to test the effects of extreme stress on individuals by subjecting participants to regular rounds of verbal and psychological abuse under controlled lab conditions. Ted, still a teenager, was subjected to years of harsh interrogations, humiliation, and mental stress, during which his personal beliefs and writings were used against him. While it's debated how much this contributed to his later radicalization, many experts believe that the study had a long-lasting effect on Ted's psyche, particularly as it involved betrayal and manipulation, core themes in his later writings. Chapter 2. Escape from Civilization. Ted Kaczynski's Life in the Wilderness. After completing his Ph.D. in mathematics at the University of Michigan in 1967, Ted Kaczynski's future seemed firmly rooted in academia. His dissertation on boundary functions was so advanced that few could understand it, and he quickly secured a position as an assistant professor at UC Berkeley, an elite university at the heart of the American intellectual world. But underneath the surface of this promising trajectory, Ted was experiencing profound disillusionment with modern life. He found no joy in teaching. The structured, system-driven nature of academic work left him cold. Kaczynski, a man who had long rejected the artificiality and alienation of technological society, began to view his role as a cog in the very machine he despised. He lasted only 2 years before abruptly resigning in 1969. He offered no explanation to his department colleagues or family. But privately he had begun to formulate an escape, not just from academia but from civilization itself. The move to Montana. In 1971, Ted Kaczynski withdrew from society altogether and moved to a remote patch of land outside Lincoln, Montana, with help from his younger brother David, who initially thought Ted was simply seeking a peaceful rural life. The property, about 1.4 acres of rugged forestland, was isolated and largely untouched by modern infrastructure. It was here in the dense wilderness that Kaczynski constructed a small 10 by 12-foot cabin, with no electricity, no running water, no plumbing, no telephone, and no contact with the outside world. This was not a vacation or retreat. It was the beginning of a deliberate lifestyle transformation. Kaczynski had no interest in modern comfort. His goal was to strip away every aspect of technological dependency. He chopped his own wood, grew vegetables, and hunted small game. He lived by lantern light, boiled water from a nearby creek, and spent most of his days reading, writing, or walking for miles through the Montana wilderness. To outsiders, it may have appeared that Kaczynski had chosen the life of a hermit. But in his mind he was preparing for war. His retreat was not passive. It was a tactical decision. One meant to reconnect with primal human freedom and to study the machine he intended to destroy. A radical philosophy in isolation. While isolated, Kaczynski embarked on the most intellectually prolific period of his life. Over the course of the 1970s and early 1980s he read obsessively. Anthropology, philosophy, ecology, history, and especially sociological studies of technology and civilization. He took extensive notes and kept journals in which he dissected the mechanisms of industrial society. His thinking was methodical and ruthless. He began writing his own ideological framework, what would later evolve into the Unabomber manifesto. Kaczynski believed that technological society was not only unnatural but inherently oppressive. He argued that it robbed individuals of their autonomy, dignity, and freedom, replacing genuine human experience with artificial stimulation, meaningless labor, and constant surveillance. Kaczynski saw industrial civilization as a kind of cancer, one that grew without end, consuming nature and enslaving humanity. In his journals he recorded thoughts like, "The Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race." This was not rhetoric. This was his core belief. He wasn't simply dissatisfied with aspects of modern life. He viewed the entirety of technological progress as a moral and existential failure. He argued that humans evolved in small-scale societies and were now psychologically suffocating under bureaucratic structures, dense populations, and technological dependence. Clashes with encroaching development. As the years passed, Kaczynski's quiet sanctuary in the Montana woods was increasingly invaded by the very forces he hated. Logging roads, snowmobiles, airplanes overhead, and expanding human development. When a road was built near his property in the late 1970s, Kaczynski was devastated. The serenity he had cultivated was being shattered by civilization. He later described the event in his journals as a defining moment, one that marked a turning point in his mindset. The road was not just a nuisance. It was a symbol of the industrial system encroaching into every last untouched space of the earth. After witnessing the destruction of nearby wilderness, he realized that passive resistance would accomplish nothing. Civilization was not going to leave him alone. If he wanted to fight back, he would need to act. He tried initially to sabotage construction machinery, and at one point considered assassinating a local forest ranger, though he never followed through. But these outbursts were precursors to something more calculated. He concluded that random acts of sabotage were not enough. If he wanted to strike a real blow against the system, he would have to go after the people building it. From isolation to war. By the early 1980s, Kaczynski had fully embraced the idea of violent resistance. The wilderness cabin had become both a physical refuge and an ideological base of operations. He began meticulously designing homemade bombs, teaching himself chemistry and explosive design from manuals and trial-and-error experiments. His goal was not indiscriminate terror but targeted, symbolic violence, acts that would draw attention to his anti-technological beliefs and disrupt the forces of progress he viewed as evil. He kept detailed notes on potential targets: professors, scientists, engineers, airline officials, anyone he believed was advancing technological oppression. His attacks, he rationalized, would be limited, strategic, and serve a higher moral purpose. In his own writings, he referred to himself not as a killer but as a revolutionary. What began in solitude was now transforming into a war. One man fighting back against a civilization he believed was driving humanity to ruin. Conclusion of the chapter. Kaczynski's years in the Montana wilderness were not a retreat, but a metamorphosis. They transformed him from a disillusioned academic into a radical ideologue and self-styled revolutionary. It was here, in the silence of the forests, that the seeds of the Unabomber were fully planted. And from this quiet place he would launch one of the most notorious domestic terrorism campaigns in American history, an intellectual and violent revolt against the world of machines. Chapter 3. A War Begins, the Unabomber's First Attacks. By the late 1970s, Ted Kaczynski had undergone a complete ideological transformation. What began as intellectual frustration with modern society had morphed into a total rejection of civilization itself. The wilderness had taught him self-reliance and stripped away his belief in peaceful reform. In his journals, he no longer referred to technological society as a problem to be solved, but an enemy to be destroyed. He was now convinced that the only effective way to awaken society to the dangers of industrial and technological progress was through violence, specifically highly symbolic attacks against individuals and institutions he viewed as responsible for advancing the technological machine. And so began his deadly campaign of terror, which the FBI would later dub the case of the Unabomber university and airline bomber, a code name that would eventually give rise to the infamous moniker, the Unabomber. The first attack, 1978. On May 25, 1978, Kaczynski executed his first bombing attempt. He placed a crudely built package containing a small homemade explosive at the University of Illinois at Chicago. The package was addressed to a professor at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute but bore the return address of a Northwestern University professor. It was discovered by campus security and, following university protocol, returned to the supposed sender. When it arrived back at Northwestern, a security officer named Terry Marker opened the box, triggering a small blast. Marker sustained minor injuries to his left hand but survived. The device was unsophisticated, a wooden box lined with nails and match heads crudely wired. Yet its very primitiveness was misleading. Kaczynski was testing the waters, gauging how his devices would travel through the postal system and respond to handling. It was the first salvo in what would become a calculated and increasingly sophisticated campaign. Escalation at Northwestern University, 1979. Kaczynski's next target was again at Northwestern University. This time, engineering student John Harris, who in May 1979 opened a cigar box-sized package left in a campus room. The resulting blast caused minor burns and cuts, but Harris survived. The second bombing mirrored the first. Small, lightly packed, and designed more to test logistics than to kill. But Kaczynski was learning. He was observing how authorities responded, how news traveled, and what kinds of devices would evade detection. Just weeks later, in November 1979, he sent his first airline-related bomb, addressed to American Airlines Flight 444, a commercial plane flying from Chicago to Washington, D.C. The device was packed into a mail bag in the plane's cargo hold. It didn't detonate fully, but it malfunctioned just enough to fill the plane with smoke, forcing an emergency landing and leading to minor injuries among several passengers due to smoke inhalation. The FBI now had a new priority: a bomber who was willing to bring down an airliner. The stakes had just skyrocketed. Birth of the Unabomber investigation. Following the 1979 airline incident, the FBI created a task force to investigate what appeared to be a serial bomber with a pattern: universities and airlines. They merged the words university and airline bomber, into a single case file codename, Unabomber. The Unabomber case quickly became one of the most perplexing investigations in FBI history. The attacker left no fingerprints, no hair, no usable forensic evidence. His bombs were handcrafted from scrap materials: metal piping, wood, nails, batteries, and sometimes pieces of wood burned to obscure any potential tool markings. Kaczynski used no commercial parts, no plastic, and even went so far as to file down the heads of screws and remove serial numbers. The only clues were the meticulously designed devices themselves, often carved with the mysterious signature, FC, which would later be revealed to stand for Freedom Club. 1980s. The bombs grow more sophisticated. Throughout the 1980s, Kaczynski's bombings became increasingly deadly. In 1980, he mailed a bomb to Percy Wood, president of United Airlines. The device was hidden inside a hollowed-out copy of the novel Ice Brothers. When Wood opened the book at his home, it exploded in his hands, causing severe cuts and burns. This was no longer experimentation. Kaczynski was perfecting his weapons, using delayed triggers, pressure switches, and combinations of chemicals that would only ignite under specific conditions. The bombs were handcrafted in secrecy inside his Montana cabin, with every wire stripped and wrapped by hand, every circuit painstakingly tested. In 1982, he mailed bombs that injured professors at Vanderbilt University and UC Berkeley, the latter being his old place of employment. These weren't random targets. Kaczynski was selecting individuals based on their roles in promoting science, engineering, and technology, the architects of the very civilization he aimed to destroy. 1985. The first kill. On December 11, 1985, Ted Kaczynski killed his first victim. The target was Hugh Scruton, a 38-year-old computer store owner in Sacramento, California. Kaczynski left a bomb inside the parking lot behind Scruton's shop, hidden in a piece of lumber with protruding nails. As Scruton picked it up, the device detonated, tearing through his chest and killing him instantly. This marked a turning point. Kaczynski had escalated to lethal violence, and his devices were now almost impossible to trace. He had learned to build bombs with zero forensic evidence, using only materials available in local hardware stores or scavenged from junkyards. He would later write in his journals about the thrill he felt after the successful kill. Excellent. Humane. No clues. No traceable materials. No connections. And I had my revenge. A phantom killer. Throughout the 1980s, the FBI received hundreds of leads but made no progress. The Unabomber operated with eerie precision. He struck once every year or two, always in different states, always through the mail or via anonymous drops. His bombs were camouflaged, often disguised as academic packages, business correspondence, or wooden artifacts. He used false return addresses, fake names, and varied the origin points of his mailings to avoid detection. Unlike other terrorists, he released no public statements, made no demands, and left no ideology, at least not yet. He was a ghost. No known fingerprints. No surveillance footage. No witnesses. To investigators, he was simply a genius-level phantom killer with a hatred of modernity. Conclusion of the chapter. By the end of the 1980s, Ted Kaczynski had become the most elusive domestic terrorist in American history. He had built a lethal campaign from a cabin in the woods, with no accomplices, no funding, and no digital footprint. His bombs had injured dozens and killed one. Yet no one knew who he was, what he wanted, or when he might strike again. For Kaczynski, this was only the beginning. The real war would come in the 1990s, when he would finally reveal his ideology to the world, and force a choice between freedom and technology, between progress and survival. Chapter 4. Letters from the Wilderness, the Manifesto and the Nation Held Hostage. By the mid-1990s, after nearly 17 years of bombings, Ted Kaczynski was no closer to sparking the revolution he envisioned. His attacks had drawn headlines and fear, but few understood the motive behind them. To him, the violence was only one part of a larger plan. He wanted to wake people up, to force the world to confront what he saw as the catastrophic dangers of industrial society. And so, in 1995, he changed tactics. Kaczynski sent a series of letters to prominent newspapers, including the New York Times and the Washington Post, claiming responsibility for the bombings under the name FC, which stood for Freedom Club. In one of these letters, he made a startling offer: If a major newspaper agreed to publish a long essay he had written, his manifesto, he would cease his bombing campaign. The manifesto, titled Industrial Society and Its Future, was a dense 35,000-word document. In it, Kaczynski argued that the Industrial Revolution had led to a world of psychological suffering, social instability, environmental degradation, and loss of human freedom. He claimed that technological advancement had made people weak, dependent, and increasingly controlled by large institutions and systems. He believed that left unchecked, technology would eventually dominate every aspect of life, turning humans into powerless components of a massive, artificial machine. His solution was radical. Society must abandon technological progress and return to a simpler, more primitive existence. A national dilemma. The demand created a huge dilemma for the FBI and the government. Should they meet the demands of a terrorist, potentially encouraging others to do the same? Or refuse and risk further deaths? After much debate, FBI Director Louis Freeh and Attorney General Janet Reno decided to go forward with publication. Their hope was that someone, maybe a friend or family member, would recognize the author's voice or ideas. On September 19, 1995, The Washington Post, with support from the New York Times, published the manifesto in full. Millions read it. Some dismissed it as the ramblings of a madman. Others saw disturbing insight in his critique of modern life. For years, the Unabomber had been a ghost. Now, for the first time, he had a voice. Chapter 5. A Brother's Suspicion. The Road to Capture. When Industrial Society and Its Future was published in 1995, it created a wave of confusion and fascination. Most readers saw it as extremist, but some noticed how eerily articulate and structured it was, almost academic. Among those readers was David Kaczynski, Ted's younger brother. David had always admired Ted's intelligence but had grown distant from him over the years. In the 1970s, the two had exchanged letters often, but by the 1980s, Ted had become increasingly reclusive and bitter. He had sent strange, angry messages about society and technology, ideas that sounded a lot like what the manifesto was now saying. Concerned, David showed the manifesto to his wife, Linda Patrick, a philosophy professor. She was struck by the writing style and the themes. It reminded her of the letters Ted had written years earlier. David was torn. He didn't want to believe that his brother could be the Unabomber. But he also couldn't ignore the similarities. A difficult decision. After months of soul-searching, David made one of the hardest decisions of his life. He contacted a lawyer and then the FBI. He provided samples of Ted's old writings and cooperated quietly, asking only for anonymity and caution. He feared what might happen if his brother discovered he had turned him in. The FBI's linguistic analysts compared Ted's writings to the manifesto and saw clear similarities. Combined with other clues, like Ted's background in mathematics, his time at UC Berkeley, his connection to Montana, and his anti-technology beliefs, the evidence was becoming hard to ignore. The arrest in Montana. On April 3, 1996, a team of federal agents raided a small one-room cabin outside Lincoln, Montana. Inside, they found Ted Kaczynski looking thin, unkempt, and stunned. But more importantly, they found a treasure trove of evidence: bomb components, detailed journals, and a live, fully assembled bomb ready to be mailed. The journals documented every bombing in detail, including diagrams, test results, and chilling reflections. In his own handwriting, Ted had described the attacks, the people he targeted, and the satisfaction he felt when reading about the injuries. After 17 years, the Unabomber case was finally closed. Chapter 6. Trial of a Mad Genius. Justice Ordeal. Ted Kaczynski's arrest in April 1996 ended a years-long manhunt, but the legal battle that followed would prove to be just as complex as his bombings. After being taken into custody, Kaczynski was charged with 3 murders and 23 injuries from his series of bombings, which had spanned over nearly 2 decades. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, including bomb materials, personal journals, and the meticulous records he kept, the most difficult question for the prosecution and defense alike was whether he was mentally competent to stand trial. Kaczynski's defense team, led by Judy Clark, initially pursued a strategy based on the claim that he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, which would suggest he was not fully responsible for his actions. Psychological evaluations confirmed signs of mental illness, including his extreme isolation and delusional beliefs. The defense argued that his apparent irrational hatred of technology and society indicated a form of severe psychosis. However, Ted Kaczynski rejected this line of defense entirely. He believed that to plead insanity would mean admitting that his views and actions were the result of delusion, thus invalidating his ideology. He viewed himself not as insane, but as a man who had arrived at a logical conclusion about the dangers of modern society, a conclusion that led him to take violent action. He refused to accept any suggestion that his violent acts were irrational, seeing them as a necessary response to what he saw as the enslavement of humanity by technology. Frustrated by the defense's efforts to pursue an insanity plea, Kaczynski demanded to represent himself in court. He believed this was his right as an intellectual who understood the importance of his message. However, the judge ruled that he was not competent to represent himself in such a serious trial, particularly given his refusal to accept the defense strategy. The court determined that Kaczynski's insistence on his own rationality and rejection of the insanity plea meant he was unlikely to act in his best interests during the trial. The pre-trial hearings were chaotic as Kaczynski continued to resist his lawyer's advice. He was determined to make his voice heard on his own terms, even if it meant a lengthy, drawn-out trial. But the reality of the situation soon sank in. The death penalty was still on the table. If convicted, he faced execution by lethal injection. This looming threat of death weighed heavily on him, and after months of deliberation, Kaczynski agreed to a plea deal. On January 22, 1998, Ted Kaczynski officially pleaded guilty to all charges against him, including the 3 murders and the 23 injuries resulting from his bombings. The terms of the plea deal were simple but significant. The death penalty was taken off the table and he was sentenced to 8 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. There would be no trial, no cross-examinations, and no dramatic courtroom revelations. The deal meant that Kaczynski would never be executed, but he would also never be free again. For the victims and their families, the resolution was mixed. Many were relieved that the death penalty had been avoided, as they didn't want to see Kaczynski die for his crimes. But there was also frustration. The families of those killed or injured by Kaczynski's bombs had hoped to see him face them in court and take full responsibility for the terror he caused. Some wished to understand why he had chosen to kill, while others felt that justice had not been fully served by a plea deal that spared Kaczynski the public accountability of a trial. Although the courtroom drama was avoided, the decision to accept a plea deal meant that the legacy of the Unabomber's violence and ideology would persist, if only in quieter, more troubling ways. The plea deal allowed Kaczynski to remain a symbol of extremist resistance against modern technology, an idea he had cultivated over the years, now immortalized in his writings and manifesto. Kaczynski's legal outcome also raised uncomfortable questions about the boundaries of mental illness and responsibility. If his views were deemed paranoid or delusional, could they be considered excusable? Or were they merely the rational thoughts of a man gone too far? And in the end, his personal decision to opt for the plea deal without acknowledging his own mental instability ensured that the Unabomber remained a man of ideas, not simply a criminal. The trial that never happened left the world with a final, unsettling image of Kaczynski, not a helpless victim of mental illness, but a determined ideologue who was willing to sacrifice lives in the name of his beliefs. His life sentence in ADX Florence, the most secure federal prison, ensured that he would never harm another person, but it also left his controversial ideas to continue influencing those who studied his case. Kaczynski was no longer in control, but his legacy would still shape public discourse about the intersection of technology, freedom, and violence. Chapter 7. Legacy of Terror. The Echo of the Unabomber. Ted Kaczynski's arrest in 1996 brought an end to one of the most devastating domestic terror campaigns in American history. However, the influence of the Unabomber didn't disappear with his imprisonment. After being sentenced to life without parole, Kaczynski's manifesto, Industrial Society and Its Future, continued to stir debate and gain attention, reaching beyond the circles of his initial supporters to broader intellectual and radical communities. What was once dismissed as the incoherent ramblings of a madman gradually gained traction among a diverse range of individuals who saw in Kaczynski's writings a sharp critique of modern civilization. Kaczynski's fundamental argument was simple yet profoundly controversial. Modern technology had led to the enslavement of humanity and irreversible damage to the environment. His anti-industrial and anti-technological stance resonated with a growing number of people who were increasingly concerned about the loss of personal autonomy in a world dominated by technological advancement. As the global conversation around artificial intelligence, surveillance, and digital control intensified, Kaczynski's warnings about the dehumanizing effects of technology were seen as eerily prescient by some, particularly among environmentalists and anti-tech activists. While the vast majority rejected his violent methods, many began to focus on the more philosophical aspects of his manifesto, which contained a stark critique of the industrial society and the technological system that underpinned it. Kaczynski's idea that the advancement of technology would inevitably lead to the erosion of personal freedoms and psychological well-being gained increased relevance in the digital age. With the rise of surveillance capitalism, where data is collected and commodified in ways that diminish privacy, Kaczynski's warnings felt less like the ramblings of a madman and more like a prophetic cautionary tale. In the years following his arrest, his manifesto began to circulate more widely, particularly in academic circles. Scholars in fields ranging from philosophy and sociology to environmental studies examined Kaczynski's arguments, debating the extent to which his concerns about technological oppression might be valid, even if his violent actions were indefensible. His writings became a point of reference in discussions about the ethics of technological progress and the relationship between human freedom and technological determinism. Beyond academia, Kaczynski's ideas found a home within eco-extremist and anarchist movements. These groups, disillusioned with the trajectory of industrial society, adopted Kaczynski's critique of technology as a philosophical cornerstone. For some, he was not merely a terrorist, but a martyr who had taken drastic action to bring attention to what he saw as the fatal flaw of modern civilization. In their eyes, Kaczynski's bombings, though tragic, were a necessary evil in the battle against a society they viewed as already collapsing under the weight of technological control. Kaczynski's work also influenced radical political groups and far-right movements that took elements of his anti-industrial rhetoric and combined them with their own agendas. His manifesto's anti-corporate, anti-globalization, and anti-elite themes were appropriated by various factions to support their critiques of the global economic system and its dependence on technology. Throughout his time in prison, Kaczynski maintained a position of unrepentance, refusing to acknowledge the immorality of his actions. He continued to correspond with journalists, philosophers, and political theorists, often discussing his ideas in great depth. Even behind bars, he remained steadfast in his belief that the violence he perpetrated was justified by his larger ideological goal, the liberation of humanity from the grip of technological domination. While the public debate around Kaczynski's ideology was heated, his own life was largely spent in isolation. After being transferred to a federal medical facility, Kaczynski lived in relative obscurity, but his name and ideas continued to linger in the public consciousness. His letters to academics and journalists allowed him to maintain a platform for his views, even as his personal freedom had been stripped away. Kaczynski's legacy is one of violence, but also one of intellectual provocation. His ideology, which combined deep-seated personal grievances with radical political theory, continues to influence certain segments of anti-tech activism. Although his actions were universally condemned, his critiques of technological progress are being increasingly examined in the context of modern society's growing reliance on artificial intelligence, surveillance systems, and digital infrastructure. Despite his violent methods, Kaczynski's anti-tech message has remained relevant, especially as we face technological challenges that threaten to erode privacy, autonomy, and individual freedoms. His manifesto, long circulated in underground forums and radical communities, remains a powerful, if disturbing, warning about the future of humanity in a world where technology continues to advance without clear ethical boundaries. Kaczynski's death in 2023 marked the end of his physical presence, but his name and ideas continue to influence future discussions about the relationship between technology and society. The Unabomber's story remains a tragic and chilling reminder of how extreme ideologies can lead to terror and violence. It also serves as an unsettling reflection on the ethical dilemmas posed by the unintended consequences of technology. Kaczynski's legacy will continue to be debated for generations to come, raising uncomfortable questions about the limits of technology, freedom, and radical thought.